Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I would first and foremost like to thank Dr. Miller for the invitation. It's a huge honor to be here with you today. So I was delighted that he invited me, and thank you to the headmaster for having me. I was nervous, but my niece Nadia Rose, sitting down here, said, "Let me tell you about Blair. Let me tell you how wonderful Blair is. Let me tell you how wonderful the students are. And let me tell you how wonderful Dr. Miller is." And after I heard that, I decided that I would come. So here I am. I didn't sleep last night. I'm as nervous as can be. Okay. And you must understand my memories of a boarding school to understand why I'm so nervous. And when I walked around your campus this morning, I realized that the world has really changed in the last 40 years. So 40 years ago, I was sent to boarding school in Britain. It was my decision. And I remember my parents said, "Do you own this decision?" I said, "Yes." And off I went to boarding school south of London. The dorm, 52 beds, all lined up, no heating, bathrooms were outside. And that was my first night. I thought, okay, I could get used to this. And then at about midnight, we had a fire drill. So I got up, got dressed, and we had uniforms, put on my suit, put on my shirt, took my blanket off my bed, and we went downstairs and lined up. And I was called out. First night, I was called out. And the question was, "Where is your tie?" And I looked at the teacher, the master, as we called him, and said, "Pardon?" He said, "Where is your tie? You're standing there without a tie." And I said, "I'm sorry, I thought the whole point of a fire drill was to get dressed quickly and come down." Now the punishment at the school, short of suspension, the punishment was what they called lines. You bought special blue paper, 25 lines on each side, and you had to pay for the paper. And then they told you which book to copy, and you had to sit there and copy. So I got a punishment of 100 lines. 50 lines for not realizing that a tie keeps gentlemen's neck warm in a fire drill. And another 50 line for talking back. Okay, now I'm glad that when I told that story last night at dinner, people said, "We can assure you that Blair is nothing like this." But that's my experience of a boarding school, and it ended up being a really good experience. But I'm not here to talk to you about my boarding school. I'm here to do 3 other things. Number one, and most important, not to embarrass my niece too much. I can imagine nothing worse for her than seeing her uncle up here. Now the good news is she said to me as I walked in, "No matter how badly you do, I will still talk to you." My second objective is to give you a little bit of a sense of how quickly the world is changing out there, and how we have to accept that the world is changing, and how we all have to ask the question, will we change in order to be able to navigate this different world? My third objective, and the hardest, and every speaker will tell you, there's a very thin line when you speak to a group that divides courage from stupidity. It's like talking to your parents. You can be brave up to a certain point, but if you go too far, you become stupid. Okay. I'm going to get very close to that dividing line in my third objective, which is to suggest what this means for you as Blair students. So these are my 3 objectives. If I succeed, big if I succeed, I will convince you it's not just what you will do, it's also how you will do it. The how will be as important as the what when you go forward. Let me get a little bit of a sense here as to whether people feel certain things. How many of you have come across either people in your family or in your neighborhoods, or you've heard about people that are really qualified but having difficulty getting jobs? Okay, that's the majority. Qualified but having difficulty. How many of you have heard of people who own homes where the value of their mortgage debt is worth more than the value of their homes? Again, a big majority. So on the first one, the numbers are stunning. We've been stuck at very high unemployment for a very long time. And the worst number is among the 16 to 19-year-olds. The unemployment rate among the 16 to 19-year-olds is almost 25%. 1 in 4 does not have a job. Now that is really consequential. Because if you're employed when you first come out of high school, you can become not just unemployed, but unemployable. Think about it. You are looking to hire somebody. I graduated 3 years ago without a job. Nadia Rose graduated this year. We're both applying for the job you have. Who would you rather go? You'll go for the person who just graduated. You don't have to wonder, what the have they been doing for 3 years? You don't have to wonder, are they still disciplined to turn up on time? So the longer you're unemployed, the more you become unemployable. That is why today, we don't talk about an unemployment problem, we talk about an unemployment crisis. Similarly, housing. A quarter of homeowners are underwater on their mortgages. They own more to the bank than the value of their house, which means it's difficult to move to new jobs, and you all get this sense of insecurity. We used to have a list of what we called unthinkables, things that should not happen. That list got so long that we've stopped keeping track. So wherever you look, there is change. And if you're living in Europe, change is happening very quickly. You are in the middle of a massive debt crisis that was not supposed to happen. And if you're living in the Arab world, you've heard of the Arab Spring. Things are happening really quickly. There's also a social side. There's this dissatisfaction. There's a sense that the system isn't working. When you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy London movement, when you look at what's happening in Spain, in Greece, in Italy, there's a sense among the young people in particular that the system itself is not working. That the system is failing to produce two things: prosperity and fairness. That is the reality. I'm 53 years old, I've never seen it like this. Now, a lot has been done to explain this. And if you wanted to simply explain it, there are 3 changes going on at the same time. And we better get used to it. The first thing is that the world itself is changing. You have a whole number of developing countries that are becoming really important. The Chinas, the Indias, the Brazil of the world. And the advanced economies are finding it hard to accommodate this change. Imagine that suddenly in your school, the size of the school doubles. How are you going to accommodate this? Who's going to give up what? And the world is having difficulty accommodating this change that has happened so quickly. The second, we in the West and we in America and Europe have too much debt and too little growth. We fell in love with credit. We believed we were entitled to buy things that we couldn't afford. We believed that house prices would always go up. So you can never make a mistake buying something that you can't afford, because next year you'll be able to afford it. We believed, and reality has sunk in. And now we have to deal with all the excesses. And the final issue, which is our reality, is our institutions and our politicians are not reacting quickly enough. The word that you'll hear over and over again about Washington, D.C. is it's dysfunctional. People don't talk to each other. People don't work together. So that's our reality. Now, there's 3 ways to react to your reality. One, say, well, there's always been problems. And this time is no different. In fact, in my business, The worst thing you can tell somebody is to tell them this time will be different, because most of the time things are not different. Most of the time things are the same. So the easiest thing to say is, oh, this is an overreaction. We've seen it in the past. It will pass, and I need to do nothing about it. The work that we've done suggests that that's a fundamental mistake. This time it is different. This time things are really changing. The world is in the midst of what we call this bumpy journey to a new destination. And you have to understand both the journey and the destination. It's not good enough to say, oh, I know what the destination is, because if you can't navigate the journey, you won't get there. And it's not good enough to say, I can navigate the journey, because if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up in the wrong place. The second way of reacting is to say, this is different, and we can't do anything about it. That is also a mistake. We can change outcomes. Collectively, we can change outcomes. Individually, you can change outcomes. So the question is not whether to say to dismiss this as too complicated, or whether to dismiss it as something that will go away on its own. The real question that we have is, how do you navigate it? Change is not bad, as long as you understand that, that you have to adjust to it. And you all have. As teenagers, you're very different than my 8-year-old, as an example. Right? And you've adapted, and you will continue to adapt. You will continue to adapt when you go to college. Now society as a whole is having to adapt. There are two elements to adapting. One is understanding what you're adapting to, and second, adapting the right way. Now you may think, well, that's so obvious. I don't need someone standing on a stage to tell me that. But there's been a lot of work done on why successful businesses don't stay successful. Why did IBM completely miss the personal computer revolution? Why did the big airlines go bankrupt? Why? Because of something called active inertia. And we as human beings are often victims of active inertia. We see something different. We say, the world has changed. I have to do something about it. I have to be active. But then we end up doing exactly what we've been doing in the past. So it's active inertia. Let me give you an example. And all this has been really well researched by a professor at the London Business School called Donald Sull. And he's had a tremendous impact on my company by reminding us how even the most successful companies can go bad. Now think about it. In my days, IBM completely dominated technology. It had the strongest brand, it had the highest profits, and it was continuously investing in its future, its research and development program. Along came the personal computer. Now IBM was based on mainframe computers. Along came the PC revolution. The board, management and staff of IBM looked at this and recognized it was what's called a disruptive technology. It would change the world. They recognized that this was a paradigm change. They recognized that they needed to adapt. There was no doubt in their mind that this was a different world. But what did they do? They went back to doing what is easiest for them. They went back to their comfort zone. Their main reaction was to invest in a better mainframe computer. And within a couple of years, Compaq, another company, ate them alive. When I was growing up, the two most dominant airlines were TWA and Pan Am. TWA and Pan Am were dominant because they had the most lucrative and prestigious routes. They would fly from New York to San Francisco and Los Angeles. They would fly to Europe. Along came Southwest, tiny Southwest, with a completely different model. They would not fly across country. They would not fly regionally. They would internationally. They would fly regionally, and they would have hub and spokes. Pan Am, TWA looked at that, understood that it was challenging for them, decided they should do more, and what did they do? They invested more in their cross-country routes, they invested more in the international routes, and they went bankrupt, both of them, eaten alive by Southwest and others. The biggest challenge we all have collectively is not just to understand that the world is changing, but to get out of our comfort zone when we adapt to it. Don't underestimate how hard that is. So what can you, as Blair students, do about this? What does it mean for you? And here I'm going to go from courage to being very close to being stupid. Because I'm going to suggest that I know something more about you than I actually do. But trust me a little bit. Let me suggest 6 things that you should be thinking about. First, education matters, and matters a great deal. Let me go back to the unemployment numbers. The national average is 8.5%. 8.5% of adults in the working population are unemployed. If you ask the question, what is the number for people who did not get a high school degree? That's 14%. So you go from 8.5 to 14% simply by that first level of education. What if you got a high school degree but didn't get a college degree? That unemployment rate is 8.7%. So the average is 8.5, and that number is 8.7. What if you go to college and get a bachelor degree? The unemployment rate among that is only 4%. Education matters, and matters a great deal, because it gives you tools to be much more flexible and much more productive. My own experience, my father, Nadia Rhodes' grandfather, died very suddenly, very, very suddenly of a heart attack. He had spent all his money educating his kids, because he believed that the greatest gift was the opportunity of an education. And I remember sitting in a room a few weeks after the funeral, and our grandfather was there. And our grandfather had gone through something traumatic, because in his lifetime, the government had changed in Egypt, and they lost all their property overnight, like this. They went from rich to poor, not because of something they did, but because the world changed around them. And we're sitting there, and he said, the one thing I want you to remember about your father is by giving you education, he gave you something that no one can take away from you. No one. Once you have it, it's yours. So education is really important, not just because of the numbers, but because once you have it, no one can take it away from you. Second issue is, if the world is changing, be intellectually open and be intellectually agile. Challenge yourself, challenge others to question. You know, I was lucky and unlucky growing up. At the age of 14, we were living in Paris. And every morning, we used to get 4 different newspapers. 4 different newspapers. One, which came from the right, the Republican side, and 2 in the middle, politically, and 1 that came from the left side. And I remember asking my dad, why do we need 4 newspapers? Why do I need to read about the same news in 4 different newspapers? And he said, because you have to understand different perspectives. You have to understand that the same bit of news can mean different things for different people. I didn't listen to him well enough. So when I went for my interview, when I was a high schooler and I was called up for an interview at Cambridge, my economics teacher, who had been really influential in my life, said, "Mohamed, read this book." It was the latest book. It was the hottest selling economics book. He said, "Read this book, mention it in the interview, and they'll be really impressed." So I prepared my monologue. Off I went. It was a 45-minute interview. Two people sitting there, one person asking the questions, and the other person, it was his room, taking notes. For 40 minutes, we talked about everything but that book. And I kept on looking at the clock, and I said, "I don't care, I have to bring this book in." So I was being asked a question that had nothing to do with the book. And I said, "Oh, this reminds me of this book." And the person who had been taking notes put down his notes, and I should have read it as a signal, I didn't. Put down his notes and said, "Tell us about this book." And off I went in this perfectly prepared monologue with my self-confidence going up and up. This was it. This was my moment. And then, after about 5 minutes of my monologue, and they listened patiently, the teacher, the second one, asked me a question that completely destroyed the thesis of the book. I couldn't answer it. He got up, went to his shelf, pulled up an economic journal, threw it to me. He said, "The fourth article is my critique of this book. Simply because it's published in the book, it doesn't mean it's right. You have to question everything." Now, somehow I still got offered a place, I don't know how. But for me, it was a lesson that be intellectually curious, be agile, don't just accept things. Be global. And I don't mean by being global is to be able to point out where India is on a map. Being global means understand how other cultures do things and learn from their mistakes. When the books get written about the European crisis, and it's a massive crisis, it's something that your kids are going to be talking about because it's changing the world. One of the biggest mistakes Europe made is to believe that it was so advanced that it could not learn from developing countries. The source of crisis that's happening in Europe has happened lots of times in developing countries, in Latin America, in Asia, in Russia. When some of us in the beginning would go to the Europeans and tell them, "Look at their experience," they would say, "No, no, 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 these are poor countries, we're very rich countries. We have nothing to learn from their experience." Well, they were wrong. Had they just spent the time of being globally open and humble, they would have learned. I learned my lesson about adjusting to different culture. I grew up a soccer player. So I got very excited when my niece Nadia Rose was playing soccer. And I remember going to watch her as an under 10 in Washington, D.C. And there I was on the sideline cheering her on. "Go on, Nadia Rose," and suddenly the game stops. The ref comes to me and says, "In under 10, we don't mention names. We just mention go under 10s. So I said, "That's absurd. What do you mean we don't mention?" He said, "That's the rule." Okay. Within 20 minutes, someone tripped her, and the ref didn't call a foul. And I did what I normally do. I says, "Ref, you need glasses. How could you not see this?" Next thing I know, the ref comes to me and says, "One more word out of you, and you're out of here." Okay, so you have to be humble about how other people do things. Number 4, understand other people's motivations. When the world changes, suddenly you are on a playing field with people who play according to other rules. They don't necessarily play according to your rules. They play according to other rules. And understand that. It's no good complaining because your rule book isn't necessarily the right one. It just happens to be the one you've been playing with. Right? So as the world gets more global, understand there are different rule books. Again, let me give you a personal experience. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I'm learning to play, or I'm playing again, all the board games I used to play as a kid. And I used to play in college almost every single day. Although I never told my parents that. My favorite game was Risk. Has any of you played Risk? Okay, about half the crowd. It's a really simple game. You have to conquer the world. Very simple. Okay? You get given armies, other people get given armies, and you have to strategically position them. And you play with dice. So if you're pretty good at probabilities, you can win that game. And I used to be, when I was your age, pretty good at probabilities. Now I'm not, but I used to be. And I used to win a lot. These days, I don't win a single game. Now, it's not just that I've gotten old. That has something to do with it. But not winning a single game. So I sat back and said, what's the difference? And I'll tell you what the difference is that these days, my mother-in-law plays with us. Now, my mother-in-law has a different rule book. She does not care if the objective of the game is to conquer the world. That is not her objective. Her objective is to knock me out of the game. Okay? That's the only reason she plays that game. And she will do some really irrational things. Okay? Now, I call them irrational because I think her objective is to win the game. She calls them perfectly rational because her objective is to knock me out. Right? And what I have failed to do is to understand that different people may have different objectives. And in today's world, different people have different objectives. They're not all playing according to the same rule book. And there's no good complaining about it. It's a reality. Leads me to my final point. Be socially aware. You are all talented students, high achievers, and privileged students. That's your reality. You've earned it in some cases. In other cases, you've been lucky. But your reality today is one of being a high achiever, a talented, and a privileged student. You can change the world. You can make things happen as you get older. But don't forget the others. There are those who haven't had your luck. There are those who haven't been empowered like you have. There are those who haven't been enabled like you have. But we're all one society, and we all live together. So as you grow up, and as you achieve things, and as you control better your own destiny, remember that you also have a responsibility to others. Now, this is not just a moral issue. This is much more than a moral issue. You also have self-interest in this. Nobody can be a good house in a bad neighborhood. It's that simple. No matter how much you improve your own home, if you don't care about the neighborhood, then you have a problem. So my fifth lesson to you is, as you grab your opportunities in life, as you make things happen, as you change outcomes, don't lose sight of others who have not been as lucky or as fortunate as you. Let me conclude by saying most projections today suggest something that should trouble you. For the first time in America, for a very, very, very long time, I'm tempted to say for the first time ever, but the minute you say the first time ever, someone raises their hand and says, what about 1762 or something, right? Or 1795. But for the first time in a very long time, the projections is that you will be worse off than your parents' generation. Why? Because my generation accumulated a tremendous amount of national debt. We lived beyond our means. We bought homes that we couldn't afford. And now, as we get older, There's all these medical costs that we're going to incur because we live longer. And guess who's going to pay for all this? You will. So your reality, and you're not at all responsible for that, but your reality is you're inheriting a world that has too much debt and too little growth. Because of that, people are projecting that for the first time in a very long time, your generation will be worse off than your parents' generation. It need not be that so. There is nothing automatic about this. You control, influence, and inform outcomes. And if you understand your reality, and if you put to use this incredible education that you are having, you can have a huge impact, not only on your own families, but also on the world as a whole. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions. I was told by Dr. Miller that you're not hesitant about asking questions. You can ask me any questions on anything.
You talked about how our generation is going to increase the numbers of going to college without education. But with the unemployment increasing, is there going to be like a bubble formed with all the credit built out?
So the question is a really good question, saying that with the demographics, with what is being perceived in terms of people coming in, and with what's happening now in terms of debt and loans, etc., what does that mean for the generations going into college? You know, this is a brilliant question because it captures so many different things. So let me try and capture some of the responses. First, it will be harder going forward to do things on debt. Okay, the system is resetting. It's a bit like you drop your phone. It comes back on, but you've dropped it so hard that not every single thing comes on. Okay, so for example, public universities today are having tremendous difficulty. Why? Because they rely on budgets. They rely on the state. The state relies on what it gets from the federal government. And in the time when everybody has to tighten their belts, there's less money coming. So there's going to be less available on public universities. Private universities are also having challenges. They are finding it harder to get donations, etc. So the average support that you're going to get if you're the average student is less. You are not the average student. That's the good news. But that's also why you have a responsibility to others that are below average students on that. The bigger issue is how do we all manage through our debt? How is your generation going to do it? How are you going to get rid of the debt that we incurred? Not because we were somehow mean people, but because we lost sight of the big issues. It's very easy to use a credit card. When I was growing up, you would be bombarded by 10 offers a day of people telling you to get a credit card. It's very easy to buy a house when you're convinced that next year is going to be worth 20% more. Everybody got sucked into this thing. Right? It was like a group behavior, and then we woke up and smelled the coffee or the hummus, as the person in Aladdin said. And then we realized we can't. Now, how are you going to do it? There's only 4 ways to get over it. The best way is to grow out of it. You know, you have problems with debt, get a second job, and pay off your debt. But it's hard. The second way is to default. That's what's going to happen in Europe. But you don't want to do that, because when you default, it sticks with you for a long time. The third way is to have inflation. Surprise everybody by making the prices change, and creditors suddenly are owed less. The fourth way is what we do today. It's a very complicated way called financial repression. If you go to the bank today and say, I want to open a savings account. How much are you going to pay me? They'll say, I'll pay you probably nothing, 0%. Why? Because the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates at 0. But you say, but inflation is 2%. So if I give you my dollar, tomorrow, next year when I come back, it's only going to be worth 98 cents. And the answer is yes, because what's happening right now is we penalize the creditors, the savers, in order to transfer money to the debtors, in order to lower the debt. So that's what we're going to go through. You collectively will have to make choices, because these choices are made every single year. So how are you going to do it? But the reality is there's much more debt and there's much less growth. And somehow we've got to make that equation work out. And it's not just a challenge for the US. If you think we are having issues, you should see Europe. This is, that problem times 100. Other questions?
Does the fact that the United States and a lot of other countries in Europe, like the UK, have become overwhelmingly service-based economies as opposed to manufacturing economies have anything to do with the debt problem? And if so, is there anything that can be done to turn it around?
That's a wonderful question. It is the fact that the US and the UK became service economies as opposed to agricultural economies and manufacturing economy, was that part of the problem, and is the way to turn it around? Answer is yes and yes. It is not just that we became a service industry. We went much beyond that. We fell in love with making paper instead of goods. Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, my industry used to be called the financial services industry. There was never any doubt that it was not a standalone industry, that it serviced something else. It could only exist because of that something else. And what was that something else? It was called the real economy, the people who make things, who produce goods and services. And the financial services industry's role was to enable Steve Jobs to get money to develop what he did in Apple, to enable Bill Gates, to enable the whole industries to work. Somewhere, about 8 years ago, we lost sight of that. In fact, the name of the industry changed. The name of the industries went from being the financial service industry to the financial industry, to finance. And suddenly, this notion arose that it was a standalone. And suddenly, we started producing paper and trading paper. Now, we were enabled by a wonderful innovation, but like most innovation, human beings, when human beings suddenly can do something they haven't been able to do, what do? They do too much of it. They overproduce it, they overconsume it. And that's what happened in finance. And then, things were going so well that you started getting theories that saying finance is the next level of capitalism. So as you develop, you go from agriculture to industry to services, and then suddenly to financial services. That is how misled we became as a society. And now we've recognized that finance can only serve something else. It cannot get too big, and it got too big. Right? And that's what now we're trying to reverse. We're trying to resize, downsize finance, and upsize the real economy. So this is a way of saying yes, right? We went too far in believing that the financial service industry was a standalone and was the next phase of development in capitalism. And yes, we can do something about it, which is to downsize finance and upsize the real economy, but unfortunately, you can't do it overnight. It takes time and it takes a lot of effort. Other questions? Back there?
Do you think that the EU's central bank opening up their funds to Greece and Italy and other troubled countries is going to just stall them from defaulting, or is it going to really help them in the long run?
That's wonderful. And we have someone here, Brian from CNBC, who can tell you that that's debated every single day. The question is, the European Central Bank has been pumping in a lot of money into the economy. You know, central banks have a secret. They have a printing press in their basement. You know, if a genie comes out and says, you know, you have 3 wishes, what do you want? One of them should be you want to be a central bank. You want to have a printing press. You can do a lot with the printing press in the basement if it's legal. If it's not legal, it's problematic. But if it's legal, and what the European Central Bank is doing to help countries is to inject a tremendous amount of money into the system. And to give you a sense of how much money they've injected 30% of GDP. They've injected almost a third of what Europe produces in a single year. So through their printing press, they've injected a third of what a whole continent, 17 countries in this case, produce for a year. That's a lot of money. It is buying Europe time, absolutely. It's a bridge. But it's not a standalone bridge. It has to be a bridge to somewhere. And that somewhere has got to be a Europe that grows properly, a Europe that is more fiscally united and more fiscally responsible in certain places. So the best the ECB can do is to build a bridge. And if you're building a bridge and it ends up being a bridge to nowhere, 2 things happen. One, you've wasted a lot of money, and second, the bridge topples over eventually. So it is a means to an end, but it will not solve the debt crisis. Other questions? Back there?
Do you believe that the European Union, being that the nations are connected and dependent on each other, is a more advanced way of an economy that would be successful versus nations being standing alone as their own single economy?
Another great question. The question is, Europe, which now, there's 2 Europe. There's the Eurozone, which is 17 countries, and then there's the European Union, which is 27 or 28 countries. The question is it better to be part of a club or standalone? First, and this is very controversial, I do not think, and this is my own opinion, I do not think that the Eurozone with 17 countries survives. I think in 3 years' time, one of 2 things will have happened. If Europe does not get its act together, it will fragment completely. And that would be a terrible outcome. Terrible. Terrible for Europe, terrible for the global economy. Why? Because when they formed the Eurozone, there was no notion of how to dismantle it. So you have the wires are connected in such a way, the network effects are connected in such a way that you can't simply unplug it. The whole thing comes down. So we, in America, around the world, have a huge interest in Europe getting it right. So when you ask, what does it take to get it right? I come to the conclusion it takes recognizing and having the courage to have a smaller Eurozone. A Eurozone among countries that have similar conditions. And that means probably at least 2 countries taking what I call a sabbatical, leaving for a while, getting their act together, because those countries, and here I'm thinking of Greece and Portugal, there is no way they can start growing again, creating jobs within the conditions of the Eurozone. They should not have been members to begin with, and today they cannot be members and serve their citizens. So if you ask me what's the Eurozone going to look like, I will tell you, I hope that they'll understand and get it right, and it emerges as a smaller, less imperfect Eurozone with a lot more fiscal and political integration. In terms of the bigger question, yes, you're much better off today being part of a region than you are being a standalone country, unless you're willing to adapt very quickly. And we're seeing different regions. So the United States is a region. Right? The U.S. as a whole is. We have rich states, we have poor states, we have everything, but it's a region, and it's a very coherent region, politically, culturally, everything. Europe is getting there. You're starting to have a region around China. Economies that understand that their future is linked to China. If you go to Asia, if you go to a Singapore, if you go to a Vietnam, if you go to a Korea, the economy they care about most is China. That's the big elephant in their neighborhood, and that's the one that they want to be a region with, and they want to be able to interact well with. So what you're going to see is you're going to see regions develop, and then you're going to see certain countries trying to go their own way, either because they don't belong in a certain region, or because they know how to position themselves really well around. But that's the world that we're going towards. Other questions? Down here?
In your opinion, what's the most important change that needs to be made on economic policy?
Question is, what's the most important change that needs to be made in our economic policy? We need what's called a Sputnik moment. Now, in your history class, you should ask what a Sputnik moment is. In 1957, the Soviet Union, the USSR, the evil empire, sent up successfully a satellite called Sputnik. America woke up to a recognition that it had really fallen behind in the space race. It was a shock to national ego. It scared the daylights out of people. Wow, if the Soviet Union, if the evil empire can control space, we're finished. And American society went through what's called the Sputnik moment. American society recognized that the world had changed. American society recognized that it needed common vision and a common purpose. And it came together in a way that was incredible. And within a few years, not only did we catch up with the Soviet Union, but we went far ahead of the Soviet Union. What America needs today economically is a Sputnik moment. The engineering of a solution, of an economic solution, is not difficult. It really is not difficult. This is not Europe. You know, the engineering is relatively easy, but the politics are horrible. You can't even get Democrats and Republicans to agree on the small things. How are they going to agree on the Sputnik moment? Now, there's lots of reasons why the politics are horrible. They are dysfunctional. And people who have been in DC for a long time tell you we've never seen it this bad. In addition, we have this very strange situation going on, which is you have the Republicans here and the Democrats here. The center, where decisions are made, are relatively empty. And then the movements that have been created tend to pull the parties further aside. So you've heard of the Tea Party. They pull the Republicans further from the center. And you've heard of the Occupy movements. They pull the Democrats further from the center. So what we need today is a political recognition of a Sputnik moment. A political recognition that we have an unemployment crisis, that we have a debt crisis. And we need our politicians to come together in order to solve it. That's really what we need. Very different from Europe, where you have an economic problem and a political problem. Now, my hope is that as we get closer to the November elections, there will be a better discussion, not of commitments that politicians have made in the past, but of what is needed in the future, and hopefully the citizens will give a very clear message of the need for unity in DC, because if we don't get political unity, it's very difficult to get anything done.
Mohamed, I think we'll end now. They have to go to class.
Okay. Let me just end by saying thank you very much, and please be nice to my niece. It's not her fault that I'm not her uncle. Thank you very much.